You're standing on a dusty road in the Balkans, summer of 2014. The air is thick with heat and the smell of unwashed bodies. In the distance you hear something, not the triumphant war drums of a returning army, not the cheers of victory. No, you hear moaning, thousands of voices crying out in pain and confusion, and as the sound grows closer, you see them. An army. 15,000 men. But they're not marching. They're stumbling, shuffling forward in a grotesque parade of human suffering. Every 99 men completely blind, their eye sockets empty, crusted with dried blood. Each group led by a single man who still has one eye, forced to witness the living nightmare he's guiding home. This is psychological warfare perfected. This is revenge elevated to an art form. This is what happens when two emperors hate each other so much that the entire battlefield becomes a stage for their vendetta. And here's the truly horrifying part. When this procession finally reached their king, the sight was so devastating that it literally killed him. He took one look at what had been done to his soldiers and died of shock 2 days later. But how did we get here? What kind of hatred burns so deep that blinding 15,000 men seems like justice? Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing acts of calculated cruelty in human history. The story of Basil the Bulgar slayer and the revenge that ended an empire. To understand this act of systematic horror, you need to understand the world that created it. We're in the early 11th century, right on the edge of what we call the medieval period. The Byzantine Empire, what remained of the Eastern Roman Empire, sees itself as the continuation of Rome itself. To them, they're not some medieval kingdom. They're the Roman Empire, the chosen instrument of God on earth, the last bastion of true civilization. Constantinople, their capital, is the richest, most sophisticated city in the Christian world. While Western Europe is still fragmented and relatively primitive, the Byzantine have Greek fire, advanced engineering, a professional standing army, and an administrative system that would make modern bureaucrats jealous. They've got libraries, universities, and a level of culture that won't be matched in the West for centuries. But here's the thing about empires. They're always hungry. And in this period, the Byzantine Empire has a massive problem. Bulgaria, the First Bulgarian Empire, has spent the last few decades not just resisting Byzantine expansion, but actively eating away at its borders. Bulgarian territory stretches from the Danube River down to the Aegean Sea, from the Adriatic to the Black Sea. They're not some barbarian horde. They've got a sophisticated state, their own church, and most importantly, they've got something the Byzantines can't stand: independence. Now, within the Byzantine power structure, there's a concept you need to understand called Oan, the civilized Christian world under legitimate authority. To Byzantine thinking, there can only be one true emperor, one legitimate heir to Rome. Everyone else, they're either subjects who don't know it yet or rebels who need to be brought to heel. And Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria, he's definitely in that second category. But this isn't just political theory, this is personal, deeply, violently personal. Because our story really begins with two men who hate each other with a passion that will define 3 decades of warfare and create one of history's most horrifying spectacles. On one side of this blood-soaked rivalry stands the emperor who would earn history's most chilling nickname, Basil, the second emperor of the Romans. Born in 958 into the Macedonian dynasty, Basil was raised in the purple, literally born in the purple chamber of the imperial palace, marking him as legitimate from birth. But his childhood wasn't some cushioned palace life. His father died when he was young, and much of his youth was spent watching regents and generals fight over power while he waited to truly rule. When Basil finally took real control of the empire in his 22nd, he was shaped by that experience. He became, by all accounts, one of the least imperial emperors you can imagine. No grand banquets, no elaborate court ceremonies, unless absolutely necessary. The man wore military gear more often than imperial purple. He never married, never had children, and reportedly lived a life that was almost monastic in its simplicity. Everything, and I mean everything, was about the empire and its expansion. The chroniclers describe him as medium height, with striking blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He had a thick beard and a look that made experienced generals nervous. He was methodical, patient, absolutely ruthless when necessary, and he held grudges like other men held swords. John Skylitz, the Byzantine historian, wrote that Basil was by nature very stern and that he never forgave an injury. Keep that in mind. It becomes very important later. Now, on the other side, we have Tsar Samuel. His origin story is actually a bit murky, which tells you something about how medieval propaganda worked. Byzantine sources tried to diminish him, but the facts speak for themselves. Samuel came to power in the 97s and 98s during a period of chaos in Bulgaria. And through sheer force of will and military genius, he not only stabilized the state, but expanded it dramatically. His contemporaries called him invincible in power. The Bulgarian sources describe him as a warrior king who led from the front, who understood both the grand strategy of empire building and the tactical details of mountain warfare. He was clever, he was tough, and most importantly, he understood something crucial. He couldn't beat the Byzantine Empire in a straight fight, so he didn't try. He used the terrain, he used guerrilla tactics. He made the Byzantines bleed for every inch of territory. For Basil, Samuel represented everything he hated. Here was a man claiming to be a legitimate ruler of what Basil saw as Roman territory. Here was someone who dared to resist the will of God's chosen emperor. And in the summer of 986, Samuel was about to make it personal in a way that would echo for 30 years. The year is 986. Basil II is still relatively young. He's in his late 22nd, and he's confident, maybe too confident. He's already dealt with some internal revolts, he's proven himself capable, and now he's decided it's time to solve the Bulgarian problem once and for all. He assembles a massive army. Sources suggest around 30,000 men, though medieval numbers are always questionable, and marches into Bulgaria. His target is the fortress of Sirakica, modern-day Sofia. It's a strategic stronghold, and taking it would open up the heart of the Bulgarian Empire. The campaign starts well enough. The Byzantines have superior numbers, better equipment, professional troops. This should be straightforward, but Samuel has been preparing. After some inconclusive fighting around Sirica, Basil decides to withdraw for the winter. It's August, so it seems like a reasonable tactical retreat. Regroup, resupply, come back in the spring. But to get back to Byzantine territory, the army has to go through a narrow mountain pass known as the Gate of Trajan. It's in the Shredner Gora Mountains, a tight valley where the terrain becomes the master and numbers mean nothing. Samuel saw this coming. He'd been waiting for this exact moment. He positioned his forces in the mountains overlooking He passed and let the entire Byzantine army march right into the trap. Then when they were strung out in the narrow valley, unable to maneuver, exhausted from the march, he attacked. The Byzantine sources tried to downplay what happened next, but the facts are clear. It was a massacre. The Bulgarians came down from the heights and tore into the Byzantine column. The professional soldiers, with all their training and equipment, couldn't form proper battle lines in the confined space. The emperor's bodyguard tried to protect him, but it was chaos. According to the chroniclers, Basil himself barely escaped with his life. He abandoned his army, mounted a fast horse, and fled back to Constantinople. The Bulgarians captured the imperial treasury that was traveling with the army. They captured weapons, armor, supplies, but more importantly, they captured something intangible: Basil's dignity. For an emperor who saw himself as God's chosen ruler, who believed in the divine right of the Byzantine Empire to rule all Christian lands, this was more than a military defeat. This was humiliation on a personal, spiritual level. And here's where you need to understand something about how emperors think, especially Byzantine emperors. This wasn't like a modern general losing a battle and then going back to strategize. To Basil, this defeat was a cosmic insult. Samuel hadn't just won a battle, he challenged the natural order of the universe, and Basil would spend the next 28 years making sure Samuel paid for that. After Trajan's Gate, Basil changed. The somewhat impetuous young emperor became something colder, more calculating. He didn't launch any immediate counterattack. Instead, he turned his attention inward. He had internal problems to deal with. Rebellious generals who'd seen him humiliated and thought they could do better. He crushed these revolts with systematic efficiency, learning patience, and the value of careful planning. But Bulgaria was never far from his mind. Starting in the late 98s and into the 99s, Basil began what would become his life's work, the systematic destruction of the Bulgarian state. And this wasn't going to be about glorious pitched battles. This was going to be about grinding Bulgaria down until nothing was left. Every year, and I mean every single year, Basil would campaign in Bulgaria. He didn't seek out Samuel's main army for a decisive battle. Instead, he went after infrastructure. He'd march into Bulgarian territory, burn the crops, destroy the farmlands, capture and demolish fortresses, then he'd march back. Next year, repeat. It was methodical, relentless, and incredibly effective. The Byzantine historian John Skylitzes describes it like this. The Emperor Basil II continued to invade Bulgaria each year and destroy and devastate everything on his way. Think about what that means for the people on the ground. Every summer you'd hear that the Byzantine army was coming. You'd have to abandon your fields, hide your supplies, hope your local fortress could hold. And even if the army passed by your particular village, you'd know they'd burned someone else's crops, which meant less food for everyone next winter. Samuel fought back fiercely. He was a brilliant defensive commander, and he made Basil pay for every advance. There are records of battles where the Bulgarians inflicted heavy casualties on the Byzantine. In 998, Samuel actually invaded Byzantine territory and reached all the way to Thessaloniki. But the problem was simple math. The Byzantine Empire had more resources, more men, more money. They could take losses and keep coming. Bulgaria couldn't. By the early 1000s, the pattern was clear. Fortresses that had held for years were falling. The Bulgarian nobility, seeing the writing on the wall, started defecting to the Byzantine side. The empire was slowly being strangled. Samuel was now an old man, probably in his 62nd, which was very old for the time, and you can imagine his frustration. He'd spent his entire life building and defending this empire, and now he was watching it crumble piece by piece. But there's something about desperate men that makes them dangerous. In 1014, as Basil prepared for yet another campaign season, Samuel decided he had to make a stand. He couldn't win a war of attrition. He couldn't outlast the Byzantine Empire, but maybe, just maybe, he could win one decisive battle that would make Basil reconsider. He found what he thought was the perfect place to do it, a mountain valley called the Clydian Pass. It's July 2014, and Basil is marching deep into Bulgarian territory with a large force. Samuel knows this might be his last chance to turn things around. He's studied the terrain obsessively, and he's found a perfect defensive position. The Clydian Pass, the name means the key in Greek, is a narrow gorge between the Belisitsa and Orashtan mountains. It's one of those places where geography becomes destiny. Samuel orders his engineers to construct a massive fortification across the valley. We're talking about a wall of earth and timber that completely blocks the pass. Behind it, he positions his army, the best troops Bulgaria has left, probably around 12,000 to 15,000 men, according to various estimates. The plan is simple. Basil can't go around the mountains in any reasonable time frame, so he'll have to come through the pass, and when he does, the Bulgarians will slaughter them in the narrow confines. When Basil's army arrives and sees the fortification, he must have felt a flash of recognition. This was exactly the kind of terrain advantage that Samuel had used 30 years ago at Trajan's Gate. But Basil isn't the same man anymore. He's in his mid-50s now, and he's spent nearly 3 decades waging war. He orders his troops to attack the fortification anyway. For days, sources say, anywhere from 3 days to a week, the Byzantines launch frontal assaults on the Bulgarian wall. and for days they're thrown back with heavy losses. The Bulgarians are fighting with the desperation of men who know this is their last stand. They rain down arrows, javelins, rocks. They pour hot oil on anyone who gets too close. The Byzantine dead pile up in front of the fortification. Some of Basil's generals start urging him to find another route to call off the attack. But Basil has something else in mind. He's been talking with one of his best commanders, a general named Nike Forest Shefus, and Shefus has a crazy idea. What if they don't go through the pass at all? What if they go over the mountain? The Belisica mountain range isn't some gentle hills. It's rugged wilderness, steep terrain with no proper trails. It would be exhausting, dangerous, and if Samuel discovers what they're doing, the force would be vulnerable and destroyed. But if it works, Basil gives CFHA's permission to try. CFHA's takes a detachment of soldiers, probably a few thousand, though we don't know the exact number, and they begin a grueling trek through the trackless wilderness for several days. While the main Byzantine army continues launching attacks to keep the Bulgarians focused on the front, CFHA's and his men are navigating goat paths and fighting through dense forest. They're moving with full equipment, trying to stay quiet, knowing that one scout spotting them could mean death. Then on the morning of July 29, 1014, everything comes together. The Bulgarians are at their positions, exhausted but triumphant because they've held the pass for days. The Byzantines are launchy. Another attack at the wall. And then, from behind the Bulgarian lines cutting through the morning air, comes a sound that must have frozen every Bulgarian soldier. Byzantine war cries. Shefus had made it. His force emerged from the mountains directly behind the Bulgarian army. The shock was absolute and immediate. Imagine being a Bulgarian soldier at that wall. You've been fighting for days. You're exhausted but confident because you're winning. And then suddenly there are enemy soldiers coming from the direction of your own camp, from the direction that's supposed to be safe. The psychological impact was devastating. According to John Skylitz's, the Bulgarian defense collapsed almost immediately. Men abandoned their positions and tried to flee. But here's the horrible genius of their situation. They'd built that massive wall across the valley to keep the Byzantines out. Now it trapped them in. They were caught between Shefus's force behind them and Basil's main army in front. The carefully prepared defensive position became a killing ground. Tsar Samuel himself barely escaped. Sources say his son Gabriel fought off Byzantine soldiers and got him away on a horse, but behind him his army was being destroyed. The battle turned into a rout, and the rout into a massacre. Thousands of Bulgarian soldiers were cut down and thousands more. The Byzantine sources claim as many as 15,000 were captured alive. They were disarmed, stripped of their armor, and herded together under guard. Battle was over. Basil had won completely. But these prisoners had no idea that for them, the real horror was just beginning, because Emperor Basil II, standing on that battlefield, was thinking about Trajan's Gate. He was thinking about 28 years of humiliation, and he was about to send a message that would echo through history. What happened next is one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in military history. Basil could have done many things with these prisoners. He could have ransomed them. That was standard practice, and it would have brought wealth to the Byzantine treasury. He could have executed them, brutal but quick and understood within the context of medieval warfare. He could have enslaved them, incorporated them into his own army, held them as hostages. But he did none of these things. Instead, Basil gave an order that must have seemed incomprehensible at first. The chronicler John Skylitz's gives us the details, and they're chilling. The prisoners, reportedly around 15,000 men, though the exact number is debated, were divided into groups of 100. Then Byzantine soldiers began the systematic blinding of 99 men in each group. Now, let's pause here because you need to understand what blinding meant in this context. This wasn't some surgical procedure. We don't know the exact method used, but it likely involved heated irons or sharp instruments directly into the eyes. Some sources suggest they used daggers to pierce the eyeballs. Others mention cauterization. Whatever. The technique, it was agonizing, and it was permanent. These men would never see again. They would be dependent on others for the rest of their lives. unable to work most jobs, unable to fight, marked forever by what had been done to them. But here's the truly diabolical part. The 100th man in each group wasn't completely blinded. He was left with one eye, one single eye. Why? Because someone needed to lead the blind men home. This wasn't mercy, it was the opposite of mercy. Basil was ensuring that his message would be delivered in the most visceral, horrifying way possible. These partially blinded men were given a new purpose to guide their sightless comrades back to Tsar Samuel. Now modern historians debate the numbers. It's very likely that 15,000 is an exaggeration, and that the neat ratio of 99%, blind to 1% one aid, is too perfect to be literally true. Medieval chroniclers loved dramatic numbers that made theological sense. But while the exact figures might be inflated, there's little doubt about the core event. A mass blinding did occur on a horrific scale unprecedented in warfare up to that point. Think about the logistics of this for a moment. This wasn't something done in the heat of battle. This took time, days probably. There had to be organization, orders had to be given, soldiers had to carry them out, prisoners had to be processed group by group, and through all of it, the screaming, the begging, the realization among the prisoners of what was about to happen to them. The men in the back of the line watching what was being done to the men at the front, knowing their turn was coming. And the Byzantine soldiers carrying this out, how did they feel? Some might have seen it as just following orders. Some might have been brutalizing enemies they've been fighting for years. But you have to wonder if any of them questioned what they were doing, if any of them looked at the growing mass of mutilated men and thought, is this really necessary? But Basil wasn't done. After the blinding was complete, he gave these men, this army of the damned, one final order. Go home, tell your king what happened, show him what the Byzantine Empire does to those who resist. And so began one of the most horrifying processions in human history. Imagine the scene. Thousands of men stumbling in absolute darkness, their faces masks of dried blood and fluid from their ruined eyes. Many were probably suffering from infection. This is medieval warfare. Nothing was sterile. Eye injuries in particular were prone to becoming septic. Some were certainly dying from their wounds as they walked. The pain must have been unbearable, constant, all-consuming, and each group of 99 blind men was led by a single half-blind man who could see just enough to witness the full scope of what he was leading. How long did this march take? We don't know exactly, but it was probably weeks. The distance from the battlefield to Samuel's location was substantial, and these men weren't moving quickly. Hay had to beg for food along the way. Local villagers must have stared in horror at this endless column of mutilated soldiers. The news would have spread ahead of them. The Bulgarian army is coming back, but you won't believe what was done to them. When this procession finally reached Tsar Samuel's camp in late summer of 2014, the old king was waiting for news from the battle. He knew there had been an engagement. What he didn't know was the scale of the catastrophe. According to the chroniclers, Samuel came out to greet his returning soldiers, and then he saw them. All the sources agree on his reaction. The sight destroyed him. John Skilitzes writes that the old king fainted on the spot when he saw the thousands of blinded men stumbling toward him. Imagine that moment. You are an elderly man who spent your entire life building and defending an empire. And now you see this. Thousands of your soldiers reduced to walking corpses, living memorials to your failure. The chroniclers say Samuel couldn't recover from the shock. He died 2 days later on October 6, 1014. The stress, the grief, the realization that everything he'd built was finished. These likely contributed to a stroke or heart attack. But the symbolism is perfect. Basil's psychological weapon had struck with more force than any sword. He hadn't just destroyed an army. His act of calculated cruelty had literally killed an enemy king, and it earned Basil his legendary title, Basil Bulgaro, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, the Deet. H of Samuel was the beginning of the end. Within 4 years, by 108, Bulgaria was completely absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Basil had achieved his goal. The empire that had humiliated him 30 years ago was erased from the map. The blinding of the Bulgarian army remains one of the most chilling examples of psychological warfare in history. In the Byzantine world, blinding was a known political tool used on rivals to the throne, because a physically imperfect man could not be emperor. But Basil weaponized it on an industrial scale, transforming it into an instrument of mass terror. What he showed was that the Byzantine Empire's power wasn't just military, it was psychological. They could inflict fates worse than death. They could break not just armies but spirits. The blinded soldiers became living monuments to Byzantine power and imperial vengeance. So here's the question. Was Basil II a monstrous tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds? Or was he a brilliant strategist who understood that terror is sometimes the most effective weapon? The blinding ended a war that had raged for 50 years. In Basil's mind, perhaps 15,000 blinded men were preferable to decades more of bloodshed. But for those men, the soldiers who lived the rest of their lives in darkness, the calculation probably seemed different. They were the living price of imperial ambition, the message written in human suffering that resistance to Byzantine power was futile. This is what happens when personal vendetta meets military might meets political calculation. It's a reminder that sometimes the most effective weapons aren't those that kill the body, but those designed to break the human spirit. So, what do you think? Was this an unforgivable atrocity or a brutal but effective end to decades of war? Let me know in the comments. And if you found this deep dive compelling, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring the disturbing realities mainstream history doesn't discuss. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next.